wisdom,
prudentia,
justice,
justitia,
temperance,
temperantia,
courage.
fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life, this is the Sunday Stoic.
Welcome to the Sunday Stoic podcast. I'm joined once again by Kai Whiting. Kai, welcome to the podcast, and would you let us know what all has gone on in your world since we last talked?
Hi, Steve. It's great to be here. And yes, I really should, because I can't remember the last time I was on the podcast. It's been a lot's been happening. I think we haven't spoke much because of the COVID issue.
It's been a bit, yeah.
It's been a bit. So yeah, I've officially finished the PhD now. So that's
Are you
nice.
Dr. Whiting now?
I am, but I tell everybody that Kai is sufficient.
Okay.
And that I don't need to be referred to as a doctor, because I feel like a medical doctor. And then I feel like someone's going to have a heart attack and be like, doctor. And I'll be like, can't help you, I'm afraid. And I'm now working for UC Louvain in Belgium.
Wow.
So unfortunately, I'm still stuck here because of the situation with COVID and the lack of certainty. We here in Lisbon were in the red for quite a bit, and then Belgium was red, and then we were free, but then we became like in the red zone, and movement was restricted. So it's a very unusual situation. Quite unfortunate, really, because it would have been nice to be able to get there. But I have been learning some French, so that when I do arrive, I can speak to somebody. But it was very unusual to have to do like French lessons whilst in Portugal. It was really a weird situation.
Are you doing live, like interacting with someone online to learn French, or are you using programs, or what's your technique?
So yeah, I have a teacher who she's based in France, and I like to learn languages like a child would. So I've asked her just to focus on sounds, because people often say like, oh, you can, as an adult, you can never sound native. And that's not true. It's just absolutely not true. We just don't teach adults, or we don't focus on sounds. We focus on meaning, and we focus on increasing vocabulary. So I spent like the last 6 weeks just repeating sounds. Like I've been reading Harry Potter because it's easy to get hold of in any language, more or less. And then just saying correct it when I say it wrong. So if you imagine a lot of kids say the word, or in the UK, we have the problem, like they say yogurt, you say yogurt, and they say logger, and you say yogurt until they get it right. And you wouldn't let your 2-year-old walk around saying logger, because you'd know they'd have a problem at school eventually. So the idea is that you'd correct them until they say it. And then you don't remember that as a kid doing that process, and you certainly do as a parent, but you don't remember it as a kid. So the idea is to basically be very focused on sounds, and if I say it correctly. So that way you do actually get a native speaker voice, because you have not attached any meaning. You're just attaching sound to letters, basically, or sets of letters. So it's been like 6 weeks of just like repetition every day. But she said I'm starting to remove my English accent, which is great, or my Spanish accent, because that comes through as well. So it's been entertaining, but completely surprising to me, and it's much harder to learn a language online than I thought it was.
So you have a paper out, and you have another project that we want to talk about that I didn't even know existed until moments ago. So first of all, there's a paper, How Might a Stoic Eat in Accordance with Nature and Environmental Facts? And then there's another project, which you can announce now, or we can wait till after?
We can wait, I think. We can wait, yeah.
Okay.
So what I wanted to ask you, actually, was when you read the paper, were you surprised by the findings? Did you think I was going to come up with some other reason as to what we should do when thinking about eating? Because let me just clarify that it doesn't tell you exactly what you should do, exactly what you should eat. So I'll never tell you should eat 2 sausages, chips and beans, for example, because that's not how Stoicism works. It always will be, it depends, right? But within the it depends, Steve, were you surprised by what I said, or what came to your mind when you read it? What did you find interesting?
What I found interesting was, I don't know if I was surprised by it, and perhaps I missed some of the point, but I think I grasped I can't even say it, grasped it fairly well. Was the contingency of Stoicism came through in your analysis, in that there is no universal answer to what to do. It is all dependent on your situation and where you are, and the best choices that are available to you depending on your location and how food gets to your location and what food's available at your location. And so Stoicism never has easy answers, and I think it comes through. But the one thing I want to know is why do Stoics hate condiments so much?
I don't know the answer to that.
like Seneca would say, why are you putting ketchup on that? Like, if you're hungry enough, you won't need ketchup on that. Actually, Musonius Rufus is probably the one who would say that, but.
Because ketchup was actually was garum, wasn't it? It was the fish sauce that was the equivalent
I'm sure
of ketchup.
That, they had like fermented fish sauce of some
they
type.
Did.
Yeah.
And it was very unusual because they would import it, even though they could get it locally. Some of them would have like favorite fish sauce from, say, Spain. Even let's say Seneca had gone over to Italy, he would then really want to eat that garum sauce from his own homeland. So he would probably import it in, and that's quite common. It was very strange because we'd always think that you want the local one because it was cheaper, but the Romans were a lot in the cities, or in the particularly port cities, they were much richer than we ever imagined. Now we're only understanding that now because we've got analysis of what people ate based on their collagen. So we know that some people who were wealthy were actually vegetarian, which comes back into like Seneca's view of being vegetarian due to philosophical or quasi-religious reasons. So it wasn't just a Seneca being fussy thing.
Yeah, what do we know? So getting into the diet then, do we know what Romans were eating then? Are we analyzing their isotopes, or how are we figuring that out?
So I'm not an expert on the analysis, but I do know that they do look at basically the collagen analysis. They can tell you what kind of protein you ate.
Okay.
So they can tell you was it meat, was it fish, or was it vegetable-based protein. But also Herculaneum, which was, some people don't know, but that was actually just as effective or more effective than Pompeii. It has a sewer. And so they actually know from the excrement, and I have spoken to the archaeologist responsible for going through the excrement, let's say that, what they ate. So they kind of liked a lot of sea urchins because they've seen a lot of sea urchin spikes. That was quite a delicacy in Herculaneum. And actually, when they did the analysis, people from Herculaneum had a wider variety of foods, or chose to eat a wide variety of foods, the middle class that is, than present day people from Napoli. So the same kind of people, but yet they actually had a richer diet back in the Roman period for the middle class and wealthy, which surprises me somewhat because they've still got the Bay of Naples. That hasn't changed. But I think food in the Roman period was very, very important. So it kind of tells you your priorities. So they did have this humongous array of foods, which I was impressed with. Napoli did seem for me at least, to have a wide variety, but to have Herculaneum have even more was quite surprising. Although one must realize that Herculaneum and Pompeii were very wealthy just before the Mount Vesuvius eruption. So they're not necessarily typical to the urban areas of the Roman Empire, but it does show that we've underestimated certainly the quality of life in terms of food. And the average person in Herculaneum was like 5 foot, I think it was like 5'5". So, and if you wanted to be a soldier, like not necessarily the most elite, but you have to be 5'7". Sorry, guys, if you're in meters, but 5'7" is quite tall. If you think in the Victorian period, people were. Well, I remember this because Jack the Ripper murdered someone who was 5'1", and they called her Tall Annie. So 5'1", if you think, well, the average soldier, not the elite soldier, the average soldier in for the Roman Empire was 5'7". Sorry, the limit, the smallest they could be was 5'7". That gives you some indication of how well they would have eaten. And obviously, a lot of people ate really badly. But then I would still say that in the US, based on discussions and analysis, there are some people in the US that eat unfortunately very, very badly indeed, and not through choice. So we have this sort of false belief that we've somehow improved over time, that we're now we're vegetarian because we believe it's like the right thing to do. You have a lot of that in sort of Europe, but it was already the case in the Roman period.
I wonder if mechanization of agriculture has something to do with variety and the availability of some variety, because for mechanization to work, you have to have fields of plants that are the same, that are all maturing at the same time, at the same height, and so we rely on that a lot these days for massive quantities of food, but not a lot of variety, perhaps.
I think you actually hit the nail on the head. I've never really thought of it like that, but that's certainly true. People say, "Oh, we've got more variety than ever," but no, because for example, Tyson Foods controls all the chicken produce. So if you've got a very select few of people whose main interest is not your nutritional well-being, they will just maximize yield and maximize profit. Whereas if you imagine if in the Roman period, if you didn't have that kind of economies of scale and they didn't work on the same economy, it was much more about delicacies and showing off, I guess. Right. You could definitely say showing off was very important to Cicero, playing the role as if he was somehow on a play, which Epictetus was just like, oh, well, it's not about that. You should play the role because it's the right thing to do because it's God-given. Cicero was more like, no, you're on the stage. So a lot of the Roman was about being on the stage, and Seneca acts as if he was on the stage all the time. So yes, I think you're absolutely right that there was the benefit in the Roman period was to create delicacies that people would want and to get reputation. Now it's not about necessarily reputation. In fact, the leaders of Tyson Foods say the best thing to do is for them to be silent. That they don't want you to know that they are responsible for 90% of non-halal chicken. Right? They're just not going to tell you that, which gives you some indication of the quality of the chicken. But
I
yes,
believe Tyson is a major employer here in the state where I reside, actually. Yeah.
But they're not very loud about it. For the amount of money that gets processed through their hands, they're just not loud about it.
And there's not just thinking about chicken, there's not a lot of diversity. And if you go back a few hundred years, we have all these heritage breeds of animals even. Let's just assume we're going to eat animals for a moment. There was a lot of variety in your options and animals that were adapted to living in different climates and so on and so forth. And I'm sure plants had, grains and other things. There was more variety perhaps when things were harvested by hand than when harvested mechanically.
Now, if we say that, that will upset the paleo eaters that are eating chicken, saying, I'm eating what my ancestors ate, because obviously that's not the case. And if you go to Africa, they find it very strange that we eat very soft chicken and we eat very baby chickens. They tend to eat chicken that's 2 to 3 years old, and it's very tough. I don't know if you've ever eaten African chicken, but I cooked it with a Nigerian friend of mine, took a bite, and the flesh did not move. And so I literally was biting it, and it just didn't come off the bone. This is back when I ate meat. And my Nigerian friend, the next day, he came up to me and he was very happy. I said, what happened, Connolly? And he said, I beat the chicken. I mean, he managed to eat it. So I was like, unbelievable. And all the Nigerians were like, I don't get you. Your chicken in this country is terrible. It has no taste. It's just nothing. It's not even got any muscle to it. And that's the point. There was no muscle on the bird. It's just sort of fat and feeling a bit sorry for itself. So yeah, there is. I think you're absolutely right that there's definitely evidence that eggs and chicken and lamb and cattle were certainly there was much more diversity back then.
So we have a lot of diversity in ancient Rome. So that means there's choices, and where there's choices, there's a chance for Stoicism, right?
Indeed.
So what do you think the Stoics got right about their ideas of food choices? Let's just talk about the ancient world for a moment. What did they have right and what did they have wrong?
I think in the ancient world, I can't really think of anything they had wrong, because the main issue that we highlight is the way that we produce food in the contemporary period. So I won't say modern, because modern's actually quite different, because modern's actually a big range. But, in terms of the 20th and 21st century post-war, world wars, the way that we confine animals is certainly against their nature. And if you think about, veal, how we staple the calf to the floor and then take its blood out drop by drop, I can't see anything living less according to nature than that. So I think that's the key thing here. So it's not exactly justice isn't only in what one eats, but also how one prepares.
Right.
How one considers the animal. So I don't think, like Cato talks a lot about, Cicero, I think, has an analysis on what kind of foods that we should eat. And Cato was very strict about being in his garden and what he'd like to do when he was there. So I think the key thing is, would they view, I don't know if you've seen this, pictures of cows with a hole in their side, so you can check in Switzerland, so you can check the stomach.
I've heard of these things, yes. I've not seen it myself, but...
Yeah, the picture was enough for me. I just can't see the Stoics in that, ancient Stoics going, that's natural and that's good. Not that because it's natural, it's good, right? I think good in the sense of that's just, that's self-controlled, that's wise. Right. I don't mean good as in like, it's wonderful because it's natural. No.
Right.
So I couldn't really see anything wrong with the ancient world unless it was excessive cruelty. And I think they had cruelty, but it was more like games they would play with the animals. So I would assume that putting a lion to fight a Christian would be unfair on both parts, right?
And I think their teleology was a little funny with some of the Stoics, like you mentioned in the article. We've talked about this before about the pig having life as a form of preservative. You know, those sort of ideas were a little off.
Yeah. So I wouldn't be, for me, that wouldn't be a question. And so let me clarify, because you asked me about what they ate. That would be more like what's their attitude about the animal,
right?
Per se, rather than what they ate. So because I didn't think they got anything wrong with what they ate, per se. It was more like the way that they view animals. So I think that was the question you asked. You were trying to ask me, but that wasn't. So yeah, the way they viewed animals, and it makes sense in a way that there's this huge gap, or it seems to be a huge gap between the rationality of a human, Homo sapien, and the next animal, I would argue land animal, because now we're aware that whales and dolphins are very intelligent. But it was only in the 1970s when we recorded the equivalent, what we would now call sound, which is more like vibration. Until that point, we actually had a whale in margarine. So up until the early 70s, because we thought whales were silent, if you think of Moby Dick, the silent killer, we had no respect for it. And then once it was recorded, the coders, so the clicking sounds, we thought that was amazing. And we even put it on a rocket, so that if aliens came, they would hear whales. But that's just like a change of attitude. Like the ability to record the communication of whales made us completely change our mind on their intelligence. Before we didn't think they were intelligent at all. So you think in the Roman period, they would not have been aware of these very deep diving animals. Mm-hmm. So they were probably looking at, the most intelligent, even perhaps a chimpanzee, which is not anywhere near as intelligent as a dolphin or an orca. In fact, we call the things like killer whale, for example. And we use words like, I don't know if you know, there's a whale called the right whale, and it's called the right as in it was the right whale for them because it was the easiest to kill. Yeah. And we still call that whale a right whale. And so it's kind of like the way that we communicate things is the way we perceive things, and then we misjudge. Our impression is incorrect. So I certainly believe, particularly with the pig, which is a very intelligent animal, that there was some prejudice towards that animal for certain reasons of how it walks around and eats and does things. So yes, I think the prejudice was there. There was definite misunderstanding on Chrysippus' part, but Cleanthes didn't have that view, and they argued about it, about the rationality of ants and bees and other animals. And I think that that was incorrect. So why does that relate now? Because I would say that if we recognize that there's sentiments, and I would argue quite strongly, based on the Neanderthal paper that we discussed before, intelligence, then the way that we treat animals should change. So a lot of people have made the argument, but it tastes so good and I really like it. Right? I don't know if have you ever heard that?
Oh, yeah.
When you've discussed it. Okay. And then I make the argument, okay, so if I wanted to have, certain relationship with an animal and you didn't think that was appropriate, based on what I did with that animal, let's say, and I turn around and say, but I like it, would that be a reasonable excuse to continue to act in that way with that animal? And I'm saying it the way I am in case there are younger people listening. But if I behaved in that way and you said to me, oh, I don't like the way you do that with your animal. I think just because it's your pet doesn't mean you should have that kind of right over that animal. And I said to you, but I like it, I enjoy it. You think I was weird, and we probably wouldn't stay friends for very long.
Right.
But if I put that same animal on my plate, we just shrug our shoulders. And that's the irony, because you say, one, you kill the animal. The other one, arguably, they don't really suffer, depending on exactly what you do. But arguably, they may not well suffer. Yeah, one is highly seen as bad, terrible, appalling, and the other, which involves murder and mass incarceration of animals, you could say it like that, that's absolutely fine, legally even in the US. And so I found that really sort of mind-blowing that we have these double standards based on our values. And you have to say, well, why is that? Why is it we're entitled to treat the animal like this? But if I treat the animal in a different way that's not going to cause them, certainly not going to kill them, why is that so atrocious? So I think that's the question I started to think about, going beyond what we should eat, is how we should treat animals. And I think the Stoics certainly need to update how they see animals. But that's going a little bit back into the Neanderthal paper. I don't know if we want to go back there or not.
Define something real fast that's in your title that I think comes to play as to where we start our conversation or how we figure this out. And that's the idea of living according to nature / according to the facts, right? This is an idea that comes up several times in your work, and you're drawing on others here as well. But could you describe the difference, or how those two, living according to nature and living according to the facts, what those are and how they may be seen as similar or different?
What an excellent question. I couldn't ask a question better myself in that way. Well, it depends on your position. So there's, in case you're new to Stoicism, there are actually like two main theological camps. So one is what we would call, quote unquote, traditional Stoics, and the other one we call modern Stoics. And generally, we've called everybody who's Stoic today, or at least says they practice Stoicism today, modern Stoics. And I actually think that's incorrect. We should call them contemporary Stoics to distinguish between the theological position. So there's one. So let's say there's two camps in the contemporary Stoicism. In ancient Stoicism, there really was only one camp. Even Marcus Aurelius, who says sometimes, is it providence or atoms, really was in I would call the Stoic God traditional Stoic camp. So the traditional Stoics tend to take majority of what the ancient Stoics believed in terms of the cosmology and the theology, as that still remains true. And they'll say things like, yes, I agree that God is benevolent, that there is providence, and that God is worthy of respect and reverence. And the way that a Stoic would achieve that is to observe nature, so literally be out in the world and observe what's going on, and try to align themselves with how they see the world. So God, in that sense, becomes a yardstick of good. So if you're a traditional Stoic and you see a cow being separated from its calf, you would start to say, oh, that's not letting the calf live according to nature. That's actually destroying I never say this word right, perhaps Steve, you quote the okiosis. So the ability for appropriation. So the calf follows its mother. We're actually separating that. We're actually reducing that bond, or cutting it completely. That's completely wrong, because that's against our yardstick, which is God. And so they would feel very uncomfortable about that. There's another group of people, which I call modern Stoics, who say, we don't have providence. The universe is completely random, but we have sets of facts, and we can derive what we ought to do from those facts, which I know people can jump up and down because David Hume said.
Is conundrum and all of that?
The is-ought conundrum. So yes, because the traditional Stoics don't have the is-ought conundrum, because they say, well, I believe that the best thing to do is to live virtuously and progress towards eudaimonia. And if you don't agree with me, then we have nothing to talk about because you don't accept my premise. So that's their premise. And if you say, well, I think that a purpose of humankind is not to live according to nature, I think it is to eat as much chocolate biscuits as possible, then they'd say, oh, well, I'm sorry, like there's nothing to talk about. That is, they don't have the issue of saying, yeah, that is what is good, and that's what I'm going for. Lawrence Becker, who was a scholar who tried to develop he wouldn't say his own version, but certainly a modern interpretation or contemporary interpretation of what the ancient Stoic world would have done if it had, quote unquote, evolved and continued to today. And he makes the case that environmental facts is living according to nature. So he would say, like, if the fact, for example, the fact is that the mother and the calf, they actually are related, and the fact is they actually prosper when they're together, and if they're separated, they both suffer, and the fact that they're suffering means that it's bad, right? I raised the point with the co-authors that that's a bit of a difficult conundrum to tackle, because in Stoicism, harming an animal per se isn't good nor bad. It depends on the reasons that you harm the animal. I know there's people going, what do you mean? But let's imagine that I harm the animal because I want to free it from a net. So I have to actually harm the animal in order to remove the the net that will strangle it eventually. So I'm actually harming it, but the reasons for harming the animal is to free it eventually, right? So then they'd say, so it's the reason behind it. So the fact that the head's in the net is neither good nor bad. That's just the fact. So this is the problem that I think that Becker's stance doesn't really solve, because I say just because a calf is separated from its mother doesn't mean that it's good or bad. Why is it separated? And he'll make the argument that through facts we can create our values, and then our values then would say what is virtuous or not. And so we argue the problem with doing that is that humankind has developed a whole set of values which are contrary to sustainability or environmental well-being. Therefore, those facts that we have, for example, that climate change is a problem, then you have the value system which says that let's say the bottom line is money, then we have a complete conflict, so that we can't jump over the 2-degree climate change is a problem, or a cow with a net over it is a problem, because our values may determine that the reason why the net is on the cow is because we don't want it to escape, because we value the money that the cow represents. And that's the conundrum we try to sort of look at and say why we think that living according to nature is actually a better framework for which to operate in. So if you say, well, I don't believe in God, I'd say that's absolutely fine. But think about whatever God means to you as a yardstick. So it's not an Abrahamic God. There's no hell. There's no heaven. There's no punishment. Is really much on what you've done to yourself on earth, right? So that's the kind of conundrum that we come to. And we say that, yes, there are environmental facts. For example, that there will be more plastic in the sea than in terms of tons than fish by about 2050. Is that good or bad? Now, people would automatically think, well, that must be bad. If I said the same thing about mosquitoes that carry malaria, I think many people would say, yes, you know what, we need more mosquitoes that carry malaria. You see, this again, the fact doesn't change our value. It depends on how we perceive that fact or the impression that we have. So that's the kind of delicacy that we try to look at. Say, yes, there are environmental facts, but the facts per se don't tell us anything. So again, taking a 2-degree increase, imagine the temperature was 30 degrees colder than it is now, the average temperature. Then a 2 degrees increase would be excellent. And we'd be doing everything we can to be burning all the fossil fuels that we have, because we'd say that was essential to our survival. And if we believe our survival is good, if we come to that conclusion, then we would burn every bit of coal we had on the planet. Problem is that we're actually increasing the temperature that pushes a threshold that is not thought to be good for human life. Might be excellent for cockroaches, but we don't seem to value cockroaches in the same way. And this again is the fact, the ought, and because of the fact conundrum that Steve first mentioned.
So what do we do, Kai? Let's say, let's bring it down to let's not talk about the sage here. Let's talk about Steve going to Kroger or Walmart, which is even better, right? So how do I make my choices as a Stoic as to what to put in that shopping cart and what to leave on the shelf?
I guess the question would be first, should you go to Walmart, right?
Well,
let's imagine
when you have only so many choices in depending where you live here.
Correct.
You have to choose what you can.
So let's imagine the only choice is Walmart. Then in that case, Stoicism doesn't come into it because you don't have a choice, right? So let's imagine you've just read the paper and you've read that there's going to be more plastic in the sea than fish. And so you might say, do I know where the fish comes from in Walmart? And the answer might be, no, I don't. You might say, could I get this information, or could someone provide it for me? No. Okay, so I don't know where that fish comes from. Should I value fish if I want to live according to nature? And I would say yes. And even if you didn't, I'd say, to be just, is it reasonable to buy a fish that you know comes from a source that may or may not be fair to its employees or fair to the environment? The answer I would say would be no. Then I would say perhaps it would be better for you not to buy certain types of fish. For example, you might say, I'll buy tuna, dolphin-friendly tuna. I think we've discussed this before. And the problem for having that label, only 2% of your actual catch needs to come from dolphin-friendly tuna. So 98% of it doesn't come from that, which is why I like Lisa Simpson when she says, well, how much percent of paper of this is recycled? And the lady said 0%. And she goes, what? Because well, 0 is a percent. So I really think the 2% and 0% is a good analogy there. So so let's imagine you say, okay, I don't need to eat fish, but I really feel the need to eat certain protein. And you might ask yourself, do I need meat protein? Now, there are some people that I would argue quite strongly do need that, and they need to eat meat, say, once a week. And then I would say, okay, if you need to eat meat once a week, then, plan your shopping around that need, because I do honestly believe that some people do need a meat intake, once a week on a, say, Friday afternoon. But then you'd say, okay, I will restrict my meat eating to that Friday. I will buy the best quality meat that I know, sort of, I don't know, free range or organic or so it's certainly been recognized by some animal-friendly organization that meat is the best meat that you can buy on the market in terms of how it treats the animals. And you say, well, that's more expensive. And I say, yes, but if you actually only eating meat on a Friday, for example, then you can afford to do that instead of eating meat Monday to Friday, where it would be too expensive for you to choose such a lifestyle. And then you might argue to me, for example, but if I buy soya, which is a typical argument, if I buy soya, that's in the rainforest, and then, all these vegans out there, they're killing the rainforest. How terrible. See, that's why veganism doesn't work. And then I'd say, well, the fact is that 70% of soya is actually for cattle feed. So there's only 30% actually goes to your vegan, so to speak. And yes, that just because you're vegan doesn't mean that your diet is necessarily healthy or reasonable in terms of the environment. So for me, for example, I make sure that I buy soya that comes from Europe, particularly, or typically, I should say, Italy. Now, the last time I checked, there was no rainforest in Italy, so I'm pretty safe there. And it's not much more expensive, and it's not something I buy too often anyway. So it is a case of, okay, what do I need to do? If you said to me, for example, well, I can't stop drinking milk in my house because I have a young child, I'd say, okay, give the milk to your child, but do you need to drink it? You see, it's easier for me to drink the milk because I've already bought it for my kid.
Right.
I say, well, okay, then pick something else. Do you need to eat yogurt? And they might say, yeah, but I need to buy my kid the baby yogurt. Like, but do you eat that yogurt? No. So then just don't buy that yogurt for you. So it's more like looking at what you can do. I would suggest if you could eat meat to use all of it, to waste the least possible, to enjoy it when you eat it and to respect where it comes from, to be aware of those things, to buy locally if you can from a local farmer, to certainly raise awareness. And perhaps when you go out to eat, you might say, well, I can't choose so much because the restaurants that I have in my local area are not vegetarian. So I've been in Cuba and pretty hard there. And occasionally I myself have to eat meat because otherwise in Cuba you actually would not do so well if you're there for a week. So it's not about having these hard and fast rules. It's about going back to principles. So always asking yourself, is this fair? Is this just? Do I have time to think about it? Not at the moment. Okay, but what can I do to give myself the time at some point to really think about what I eat? And we make the argument that fast food isn't particularly stoic because my Rufus would say that it wasn't really healthy for you. And I would say a lot of fast food is particularly meat burger based. So it's not like stripping away until you're basically in a vegan diet. As I said, I think there are certain people that do need a protein intake, but not to have a hyperbolic sort of, oh my gosh, if I don't eat meat, I'm going to die. I mean, that's, and I have heard that from a lot of people. I'm going to die if I don't eat meat. I'll be really ill. Well, I'm not saying don't eat it. I'm just saying eat it less. And the same thing with vegans. I've seen vegans who have been, quite unwell and could have done with the odd egg or two and just been too extreme about it and said, well, obviously if you're healthy without egg, that's fine. But if you feel that you need 1 or 2 eggs, what is the problem? You want to be healthy. You want to have a healthy body and a functioning mind. So within those sort of boundaries of finances, family commitments, and health and preferences, right? There's some people go, well, I just don't like vegetables. I just can't have a diet completely based on vegetables.
I know
I don't like
people
it.
like that. Yep.
Are they for? Or
No,
okay.
unfortunately, no.
So it's not about having a hard and fast rule that you can never break. And although vegans might say that's completely offensive, and I have had that, I would ask them, okay, if you were in a desert and you hadn't eaten for a week, you've had enough water but couldn't carry any food, and a Bedouin person comes along and gives you a dry piece of camel meat that's got condiments and stuff, would you eat it? I think the answer in most cases would be yes, because the principle is that I want to survive.
Right.
And I don't see the need necessarily of being very strict on what one eats without going back to the principle. So a lot of vegans were a bit upset with me because they wanted me to come out and champion a vegan diet, which would be completely insincere and unstoic. But I did say that we should certainly go into that direction because there are nearly 8 billion people on the planet. Most of us live on the coastline, and a lot of poor people will die if climate change continues because they will flood, their land will flood, and the European and North American view on it isn't exactly let's welcome all these refugees in.
Right.
I mean, that's just not the case. People go, oh, they won't die, they'll go over to America. I just can't see that happening the UK, based on what I know from policy. So, and if you've seen enough disaster films, whenever you have to get into, I don't know, a bunker or something, there's always this sort of free fall into who's going to get into the last van or the last plane. So I've not got a lot of faith in our government to allow the entire population of Bangladesh to just get up and move to Texas. So if you're one of those people who are like, we'll sort that out, perhaps look at foreign policy in various countries and say, perhaps it would be better that we ate reasonably now, and so the people in Bangladesh can stay where they are, than have to deal with an entire displaced population moving to the US and having to deal with those problems, because then we'd only have ourselves to blame, like literally. Of course, we'd try to politically blame somebody else, but as a Stoic, it's part of it is being honest, right, with what's actually going on.
So it sounds like to do this well, one needs to be fairly well informed.
Yes.
It's hard to be an ignorant Stoic, although I guess
it's a contradiction, isn't it?
I guess no matter what, you have to use what knowledge you have to the best of your ability, regardless of the level of that information. But
correct.
I was thinking we need a Stoic's field guide to the supermarket here, and we can rank food according to region on. We need a unit like Xenos, like 1 to 10 Xenos on how. But that book, if you had a book, a field guide, Stoic guide to the supermarket, those numbers would shift depending on where you're standing.
Correct.
Like fish, getting fresh fish while I'm standing next to the ocean, let's say, may have a different number of. A different amount of impact than me getting sushi in the middle of a landlocked Arkansas, because that had to get here somewhere. So there's levels of complications here depending on where we are.
So yeah, there is no ranking, which is why Stoics would say that rank things like a paleo diet to rank things as what was historically made the most sense always makes me smile, because people say, well, in the graves you only have bones. Well, yes, because the plants rotted. It's like just not taking these absolutes, or I don't have an issue if people want to have a meat-based diet, particularly if they have a reason for it. So I'm aware of people and have met their parents or people who are allergic to plant-based material. They can only eat mushrooms and meat, and they literally eat like a lion. They eat once a day. So I'm not going to sit there and then like rank according. Everybody's the same. Like we said earlier, right. There's no universal diet, and it would be absolute nonsense for a person standing on a oceanic island to be like, no, I want soya. That would be absolutely contradictory to everything that Mr. Rufus says about simplicity. So there can be no field guide. So that's the irony of books called How to Be a Stoic.
Right, exactly.
It's not. Before you get into Stoicism, it's a really useful book. But as you get into it now, you realize that the title is actually a misnomer. It's not really. How to Be a Stoic really depends on who you are and where you are. Of course, you could argue that book was predominantly for the North American market. So yeah, you can play that to me. But yeah, we don't have a ranking system because it really depends on who you are, how old you are, what your family values are. For example, if my friend says to me, or my mum says to me, oh, but I don't like vegetarians and I think they're the most evil person on the planet, and I'm sitting in a house, it's not particularly Stoic for me to have an unnecessary argument. And so actually in my case, I only eat meat normally at my mum's house on a Sunday when I'm there. And that changed her mind completely, because she's like, oh, she always tells people, oh, my son, he's vegetarian, but he eats my Sunday dinner. And that actually means a lot to her. And she goes around telling her friends that. And so I know that that's really important. And that to me was important value, to say, yes, she is part of my circles of concern. I don't have to be so rigid that I break a really important relationship to me, because when my dad was like trying to get me to eat on other days, she would cross her arms and say, Tim, he only eats on Sundays and he only eats my food. So you can get other people on your side without being like vicious, right? Not saying I look how holy I am because I'm vegetarian or something. So yeah, there is no field guide. It really depends on preferences. So if you offered me meat at your house and you didn't know and you were being very welcoming, I wouldn't turn it down. If you knew, on the other hand, and I told you and you were doing it to be mean, then I would respond in a different way. So it also depends on who you're with, what the circumstances are. But I tend to say in that paper with the co-authors, it's normally that in your house, when you're over 18, when you have your own income, it's making those choices, not when you're living with your mum and you don't have those choices, or you're unemployed and you just get whatever you're given. Right. That's not, Stoicism is not so militant in that way, where also restrictive. It's more like when you have flexibility, when you have and where you have agency, use it, and use common sense, right? I think Stoicism is a common sense approach.
Well, we can't have a field guide, but I just got word that there is a book coming out called Being Better, Stoicism for a World Worth Living In. There we go. There, I got it.
Yes.
So tell us about this book. So
it is not a field guide. We don't tell you. So I should start. Well, this is a project that Leonidas Konstantakos, so he's my long-time collaborator, I would say. It's been years now. We decided that we were a bit frustrated with only having Silicon Valley Stoicism really, in the news and in the New York Times. And we thought maybe we should go back to the principles. So we decided to read the stories in great detail of various ancient Stoics and find modern examples, but not necessarily Stoics, who showed, at least in one aspect of their behavior, a sort of Stoic principle. So I'm not claiming that the modern examples we use are Stoics by definition. I'm just saying that example is a modern, useful example to illustrate a principle. So every chapter we take a Stoic, so Zeno would be chapter 1, and we tell Zeno's story, and then we say what we learned from that story. But we also have some more obscure Stoics. So we have Pasidonius, and we have Panaitius, and we tell their story, and we tell Spherus' story. Spherus was the Stoic who took Stoicism to Sparta. And most people think that the connection to Stoicism and Sparta is because it's a macho kind of philosophy, but that's not actually true. The connection is that Spherus, Zeno's student, took Stoicism to Sparta and taught something important, which I can't tell you what it is. I'll be telling you the chapter. So we basically took each story in turn and said why this underlying principle was useful in Stoicism. So one of the principles is living according to nature. So there's no field guide because we don't say what one should do. We just highlight the underlying principles and show you what's Stoic about that. So I'll just give you one example. So we talk about, that is in the book, a modern example. We have the example of Pat Tillman, that most people who in the US know, Arizona Cardinal, so American football player, who decided not to renew his NFL contract because he wanted to fight in Iraq. We also have the example of Catherine Gunn, who is a British spy who got wind of an internal memo that the NRA had sent to undermine the UN. So one of them was pro-war and the other one was anti-war. And we use both their examples as, because of their position, that was the right thing to do in Stoicism. So Pat Tillman, the way that he was a very physical individual and he was a very patriotic man who really held America in high esteem and wanted to do what was right because he didn't want because they were going to go to war. So he felt that having somebody of good reputation and value was a very useful thing to do indeed. So he should be at war because they were going to go anyway. Catherine Gunn, at that specific moment, the British spy, she realizes that if she doesn't do anything, there will be an illegal war in Iraq. And so she's stoic in trying to stop it, given the information that she has and given her position. Whereas Pat Tillman was never in that position. So that shows that the war itself isn't indifferent. It just depends on your attitude towards that war and your reasons for either being in it or not being in it. So that was the example that we gave to show that there is a big difference, because people often say war is wrong, and Stoicism doesn't say that at all. So we gave those two examples to show why, depending on who you are and what you know, war could be right or wrong. So if Catherine Gunn had done nothing, knowing that it was going to allow an illegal war, you'd say that was cowardly. Mm-hmm. You'd say that was a lack of justice. Now, Pat Tillman, who had no way of knowing that information and went to support his colleagues because he thought it was the right thing to do, and that playing American football was frivolous in comparison, you could say that he was courageous for stepping away from the NFL, from the football field. He was self-controlled in that he turned down a lot of money to do what he thought was right. You could say that he had a strong sense of justice. That it wasn't fair that American men were laying down their lives whilst he was kicking or catching or tackling somebody. So you can see in both cases that there's nothing wrong with Pat Tillman's response to war. Had he had the information that Catherine Gunn had, that would be a very different scenario. So I think that kind of shows us, again, the food analogy. So we basically go through a chapter by chapter, underlining a principle, and give an ancient example and then a modern example, and some personal examples as well. So there are some examples that I've spoken about here about how I came to Stoicism through my grandmother dying. So that's also talked about, and how that helped me reflect on what it means to be better, or, what one should prioritize in life. So it really was a response to this whole sort of Silicon Valley Stoic excessive what does Stoicism mean? And it was about success and money, and we just sort of gave it a different look about what does success mean and why would money be important anyway. But we also talk about very wealthy people, because obviously Marcus Aurelius was about as wealthy as you could get. So we also show that money isn't indifferent, and that's why we just felt that it just needed to be more balanced. And a lot of female Stoics had said that they didn't feel included in this sort of Silicon Valley business-based model, because they just didn't see it. So we felt that we should write a book that it literally didn't matter who you were. You could find something useful in it, because it wasn't particularly targeted to a particular group of people in a particular city or a particular ilk, shall we say.
And so that comes out in April, it looks like. Now,
in the US, yes.
In the US, anyway.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we should figure out what the most ethical source of book buying is. Probably not Amazon, right?
Yeah, I mean, because people have asked me that, actually, because that's the only workplace that is on pre-order. So then I said it depends, doesn't it? So if you're based where I am, you can't get the book imported. You can't get it imported. So again, I'm not going to tell people where to buy the book, because it really depends. And people say to me, I only buy on Kindle. If you only buy on Kindle because you think that that's the most environmentally friendly way of doing things, then that's your business. You just have to make your decisions. Like, personally, if I was in the UK, I'd prefer to buy in a local bookshop, always. But in Portugal, I don't have that. I don't have that luxury of being able to buy myself a copy. And I will have to buy myself a Kindle copy so that I have an electronic version, which the author never gets an electronic version. I don't know that. But you're supposed to, it's good for you to have a Kindle copy so that you can see what it looks like. So if there's a problem, you can highlight that there's an issue with a Kindle version. So you have to buy your own Kindle version anyway. So I will be buying one Kindle version. So I know I'll have to buy that from Amazon. But in terms of physical copy, I would highly recommend that you order it from your local bookshop if possible, particularly as the COVID situation has made it very difficult for smaller bookshops to survive. And also, it's nice to encourage them to buy more and to share in your local area, because if it's on Amazon, it's kind of it's hard to build a sort of community or a book club around that, I would say. Right.
Yeah, I know here in town the local bookshop's philosophy section is if you're watching the video, it's about that big. It's got about 7 books in it, so probably would have to special order that one here in Conway. But
well, they said it wasn't going to be. It's not going to be in a philosophy because it's not an academic book at all. So it's actually going to be in self-help. I've been told. I've been told because the being better is the idea of what can I do to be better. What does that mean? And because we make the argument that being better at your job in terms of making more money or promotion isn't really what Zeno meant. So make the idea that if you're only being better in order to benefit yourself, then you've kind of lost the idea of Stoicism in the first place. I think we just talked about this like 2 years ago now. So it's about being better for yourself and for the world, which is why it's a world worth living in. So it wouldn't, I mean, I don't know if it would be the philosophy, and I'm not the marketer, so I can't tell you, but the original idea is that it is in the self-help section. It's not aimed at academics, although there are endnotes and there are footnotes. If people really want to know, for example, where exactly something comes from, we did put it in the footnote, like what was the three maxims linked to the oracle? So that's in the footnote where it is at the moment. So where did Plato say that? So if you really wanted to check that I knew my thing, and Leo gave me the right information when I sorted out the footnote last night, like you can check that. So my idea is that somebody who has no idea of Stoicism can look at it, but also somebody, even I'm hoping that AA Long would appreciate the effort of the footnotes and certainly the endnotes. So there is academic parts in it, but that's the endnotes. So if you're really into Stoicism, you have that choice. But we were having a discussion with the publisher and like, okay, how do we do it so that AA Long or I don't know, John Sellers perhaps, who's more known across the podcasting world. How would John Sellers get anything out of it? And so the answer, what we believe, is yes. Would he get as much out of it as somebody who's less informed? Probably not. But what we were hoping he would say, I didn't know about that source. I didn't know about that primary source. You've surprised me. If I get an email from John saying that, I think I've done the job. So the idea was to have sort of three, different layers. So you can read it very superficially. You can give it to, I've been saying you can give it to your partner who hates Stoicism because she thinks it's really selfish. So the idea is that you can give it to her and she'll be like, it's still selfish, but less selfish, or whatever she thinks. But also, if you're really into it and you want to know the primary sources, the idea is that that's also available. It is today, that could change, but I am fighting for the endnotes. So
great.
I think it needs to be there.
Well, we'll look forward to that. If the Sunday Stoic 2.0 exists at that point, we'll have you back on.
Thank you. If people are also interested, I don't know when this comes out, but I will be presenting a bit more on the book on the 24th of October for Stoic on X Midwest, and in Portuguese for the Brazilian version. So if you are a Portuguese speaker, we'll also be doing it then. So I don't know when it comes out. So if you missed it, I'm sure Greg Sadler might have a recording somewhere. The guy's pretty good at that. Otherwise, I'm open to questions. I can't tell you too much, but I'm open. If you have a question about what kind of things it covers, as you know, Steve, I'm always open to emails and Twitter. So, and obviously, I'd love to come back if there's a Stoicism 2.0.
Sounds great. Well, Kai, is there anything else you want to leave the listeners with?
I just think I would like to ask you one question, as it is possibly the last podcast that we do for a while, is what has been your favorite memory whilst interviewing, or whilst we've interviewed each other, I would say? Is there any memory that sticks out?
Well, you're the only interviewee that asks me questions.
Oh, there you go.
I think you're about it. You'll just say, "Oh, what's your opinion about blah?" And every time I've interviewed you, you always do that. And typically that's not the case with other folks. So.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, because you educate me, particularly about, I love, personally for me, it was the story you told me about the piranhas, when you said that if piranhas were in a group, they're completely vicious, or vicious in the non-Stoic sense. they're quite vicious creatures. But you told me that if a piranha was by itself, it gets extremely stressed and its heart rate climbs because it really thinks it's going to be eaten. And I never knew that. So you've told me a lot about things and taught me a lot about farming, because that's why I think also I often ask you for advice. I think it would be silly of me. I would be wasting a golden opportunity had I not asked you questions. And also when I talk to you, you help me form an opinion or make me think about things that I've never thought about before. And like I said, oh, I've never thought about that. And I've often said that in the podcast. And I'm not ashamed to say it. I'm not I'm one of those, or both of us, neither of us are one of those academics who like, I'm an academic with letters after my name, and I'm always right. I'm like, I'm an academic with letters after my name, and they mean nothing necessarily. Like, I could be completely wrong. And I think that's the dangerous thing about being an academic, that people automatically assume you're right.
Right.
Really dangerous.
Oh, you know everything now. You are a PhD, Kai.
Exactly, and that's just nonsense. That's just absolutely nonsense. So yeah, I didn't put doctor on. The doctor is not on there. I was like, no, because I think it can be a false impression, because people give the word doctor. And for example, Dr. John Sellers is a doctor in Stoicism. I am not. So I didn't want to put myself on that pedestal, which I should promptly fall off. I'm waiting for you, Steve, to email me and say, Kai, you've referenced me and spelled my surname wrong. So I'm waiting for that kind of stuff.
I've seen people who are doctors in something completely unrelated to the works they're using, and they do sometimes use that title to give themselves credibility when it shouldn't really apply. I have seen that many times, especially when folks want to sell you something like a pseudoscientific product, for example. You may see Dr. So-and-so says it's great. It's like, well, they're a doctor in history. Why would they know how this pill works? You'll see that all the time. I've
seen it even in Stoicism. I've seen Stoic practitioners who have tried to sell a book or two or a course or a weekend away doing the same thing. And then when I've looked up what they're doctoring, it isn't Stoicism. So I think, like, yes, you might pull the wool under somebody's eyes, but I think honesty is always, the best policy on that. And I'd rather people say, well, you're not a philosopher, but oh my gosh, you really know something about philosophy. Or the philosophy department in the university I'm in Belgium were like, what do you mean you're not a philosopher? You think like a philosopher, you write like a philosopher. How is that not possible? I just say, well, I just didn't do my PhD in that. that's why. So, but that's the credibility that I want. That people say, no, he hasn't got those 3 letters, meaning that he's a doctor in philosophy. But if I am a philosopher and I have read his work, like I look at, like, for example, what Greg Sanders says, and I look at what John Sellers says, and what A.A. Long has told me, and Professor Chris Gill, and they have worked with me and have no issue with that. So I think that's the best credibility that one can have. Or working with Professor William Stevens, who's an absolute gem and fantastic, and really pulled me up. The same as Professor Gill and Long. They really were like, Kai, what are you doing? So, like, they really pull you up and they really educate you, and it's a very humbling experience. And I think if I had put a PhD, sort of shiny on that, they would smell it and go, this guy, he's not for real. Why would I lend my expertise for just take all the credit, rather than saying, if it wasn't for William, for example, the beautiful English language that has come out of that food paper it wouldn't have happened. That was certainly Professor Stevens doing that. He's got a way with words and fantastic teacher, and he was really helpful.
Well, we should always be thankful for our mentors and those that we surround ourselves that make us better, and we need to go beyond that to think about what's on our dinner plate and where it comes from, right?
Indeed. Well, thank you, Steve. It's been fantastic. Thanks for
joining the podcast. Once again, still the most frequent guest on the Sunday Stoic podcast.
Love it. Bye, Steve.
See you, man. Carpe diem. All right, let me hit stop.